Hey guys, and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about flowing in policy debate. So first, it's probably important to address why we flow. So the most important reason is that it's the way that judges keep track of the round by taking notes on each speech and comparing the arguments made by both sides and which arguments they carry through to the end of the debate. Now, because this is the standard way that judges view rounds, we also want it to be the standard way that we view rounds, so that when we're thinking, how do I best persuade this judge that I have won this debate, we understand what point of view that they will have and sort of the perspective that they will have when adjudicating the round and make our decisions accordingly. If we are behind on the flow in the eyes of a judge on a particular argument, we may not want to go for that one, for example. Another reason to flow is that it helps you know which arguments you need to respond to. So if your opponent makes several arguments, you want to make sure you're responding to all of them, or at least all of them that matter, so that you don't lose the debate by needlessly conceding some argument that could have been easily rebutted. And finally, a reason to flow is to help you improve at debate, because a flow is a written record of the round helps us analyze our rounds at a later time, whether with coaching staff or with our teammates. And it allows us to perhaps discuss strategic errors or even, good things that happen within rounds. It allows us to do redos of speeches that happens within the round so that we can get better and that so we can concretely improve our debate strategies based on real world debate experiences. But next, I think it's important to discuss how we flow. Now, there are some important conventions within policy debate about, how we organize our flows before we even talk about what we're writing down. So in policy, you flow on many sheets of paper. In other events, you may be used to flowing the affirmative case on one sheet and the negative case on another sheet. But within policy, it's a little bit more complicated since there are more positions. Each sheet of paper generally represents a different position, and both the affirmative and the negative will tell you how many sheets they want their arguments to be flowed on. The 1AC, for example, may contain two sheets, an advantage and a framing page, or two advantages, basically distinct arguments, and each one will get its own sheet, whether that's an internal link scenario that results in a particular impact, which would be an advantage, or a series of sort of framing reasons with which to prefer a particular impact, which would be a framing page, or something like solvency, which is a sheet which would just explain how the affirmative solves for whatever scenario it is describing and its advantages, which is sometimes used. But the affirmative in the 1AC chooses the affirmative sheets. In the negatives for speech, the 1NC, they introduce some new sheets as well, and those are called off-case positions. You can check out some of our other videos in explaining what those are. But each new off-case position that the negative introduces, things like counterplans, disadvantages, topicality, critiques, each of these gets its own sheet of paper because this is the first time that anyone within the debate has been talking about it. So, you can introduce a new sheet and start with the first column from the 1NC. And then they also respond to the affirmative sheets, whether those are the advantages, the framing page, the solvency page, and those responses go in the second column of the already established affirmative sheets. And so separating sheets like this makes it easier to classify the arguments that the round comes down to and understand what are the different arguments that are competing on each of these pieces of paper. It also makes it easier to kick arguments. Kicking an argument is when you decide that you're no longer advocating for it, or you're no longer saying that it's a reason to vote for you, and so the judge can simply disregard it in their decision. So if the negative tells me to kick one of their disadvantages, as a judge, it's really easy, because I can just say, okay, they conceded defense, so I'm going to remove this piece of paper from the table, and I'm no longer going to look at it when I'm deciding what my decision is going to be. So that's how we separate flows within policy debate. But I think we can get to a little bit more fun and a little bit more important discussion in looking at what we actually flow. So the most important aspect is going to be that your flow makes sense to you. The second most important being, of course, if necessary, that it makes sense to your partner. But for flows to be readable, it's best to follow some conventions, and there are several conventions within policy debate. The first thing is, as I mentioned before, you want to flow in columns, but because there are a lot of speeches within policy debate, and each speech should represent one column, you're going to have to flow in somewhat skinny columns. On affirmative pages, there are probably going to be a maximum of 7 columns, and on negative pages, there are going to be a maximum of 6 columns. So you do want to keep that in mind when you're starting out with your first column width. You want to keep your column width even. Sometimes it helps to fold the paper, but as you move forward in debate, you can just sort of freehand it as it makes sense to you. Next is that you should use proper spacing. I can't emphasize this enough. Because if someone makes one argument in policy debate, typically that gets responded to with 3 arguments. So you have to make sure that there's enough space to accommodate this in-depth debate that will be occurring on these various layers of the debate, which is why a general rule of thumb is that you want to use at least 3 fingers of space between each card that is read in a constructive. Another rule is that you want to use shorthand. Now, again, the shorthand should make sense to you, but I'll list some common symbols, which hopefully you can pick up on. There's no need for you to memorize these, but if you're looking at someone else's flow or a judge's flow, these might help you. So UQ stands for uniqueness, L with a circle stands for link, IL, sometimes with a circle, stands for internal link, an exclamation point stands for an impact, X with a circle around it stands for extinction, CP stands for counterplan, DA stands for disadvantage, T stands for topicality, K stands for critique, the forward arrow stands for leads to or causes, the up arrow corresponds to increase, the down arrow can mean decrease, S with a circle around it can mean solves or solvency, and the empty set symbol or the null symbol generally means not. So when something doesn't happen, you don't want to write out the word not, just draw a circle and a diagonal line through it. Another convention is that you want to underline cards and don't underline analytics or do something else, draw a squiggly line. In addition, if you miss something within the debate, put an X, like say you miss an author name or a year, put an X and then clarify within cross-X or look at your speech doc, go back later, so that there are no holes in your flow and you remember that you need to fill the stuff that you missed. Another key tool is that you want to flow the affirmative and the negative in different colors. That way it helps your brain to process information and understand which arguments are coming from which side. The second speech on any particular sheet should set the order. So on any negative off-case position, the 2AC should set the order for how the rest of the debate is going to go down on the line by line or on the flow. And so yeah, I would say additionally for the affirmative sheets, the 1NC will set the order because that is the second speech. So if the 2AC decides to answer the impact of a disadvantage before the uniqueness, then that'll be the order that you should go in for the rest of the debate to make it a little bit cleaner and a little bit easier for the judge to flow. And the final most important part of flowing is that if you're confused about something, or if after the end of a debate or end of a speech you are still confused about an argument, you can simply ask your opponent about it in cross-X. And like I said earlier, make sure there are no holes in your flow because in order to respond to your opponent's arguments, you first have to understand them. So now we can look at a good flow and a bad flow. Let's start with this good flow. Now, off the bat, I'll provide some ways in which this flow could improve. First, I think it could leave some extra space at the top in case there is an overview in later speeches. That's just a general tip. Second, I think that its spacing for the 1AC is very good, but its spacing for the 1NC could use a little bit of work, especially in the middle. But there are a lot of positives, a lot more positives than negatives to take away from this flow. One is that it flows the 1AC and the 1NC in 2 different colors, which is always important. Second is that it uses numbering and lettering from the 1NC to flow those arguments in order to better organize them and perhaps better respond to them in a 2AC, block, 1AR, or any speech later in the round. It uses a number of shorthand symbols and abbreviations that make sense to the individual who is flowing. So it cuts down on the time that you need to spend writing. The columns are very skinny, The tags are descriptive and contain the essence of each card without overly explaining them. And they're really not missing any arguments. Any arguments they may have been missing, it looks like they filled in cross-X. Now let's look at a bad flow. Immediately, right off the bat, they didn't use two different colors. There's pretty much no organization at all. There's no numbering and lettering. There are no columns. You're simply flowing in paragraphs. So it's difficult to connect an affirmative argument to a negative argument because you don't know which part of the paragraph connects to which part of the next paragraph. It doesn't use shorthand. It simply writes out sentences. And it seems as though it over-explains certain arguments, like why a decline is coming now, or perhaps why a decline is inevitable. But it misses other arguments, even if you look sort of clearly denoting its confusion in various parts about how decline can be good. And they did not clarify in cross-X, or if they did, they didn't write it down on their flow. So I would say that if this person were giving a speech, say the 2AC, they would have a lot of difficulty on this sheet tracking which affirmative arguments they need to extend, which negative arguments they need to respond to, because it is simply far less clear than the other flow that we saw as an example. So hopefully that all makes sense to you. Flowing within policy debate is a lot like flowing within other events, just because there are some different arguments and oftentimes more arguments and more complex arguments. Our flowing conventions have to be, even more precise and even more organized in order for us to succeed within debate rounds. But hopefully, based on what you saw in this video, you're able to successfully flow arguments and, put yourself in the running for having a good, precise round where you don't drop any of your opponent's arguments, and you are able to clearly explain your own ideas because you have an idea of what they actually are. So that concludes this video, and hope you guys had fun. I'll see you in the next one.